Hello, everyone. My name is Cami. Thank you so much for kicking it with me today. If you haven't been here before, welcome. And if you've been here before, welcome back. When I tell these stories, I always begin by letting you know that the information that I'm discussing is all public. Whether I found it via Google searches, on social media sites, old newspaper articles, everything that I'm sharing here today is public record. I also want to state that by retelling these stories, I in no way intend to cause any additional emotional trauma to the family of the victims. So today I'm bringing you another story out of my hometown of Jackson County, Michigan. And let's go ahead and get right into the story. On Sunday, February 16th, 1997, a 35-year-old man, Mark DelJanovan, and I apologize if I'm saying that wrong, was enjoying a day of court-ordered visitation with his 6-year-old son when he did the unimaginable. But before I get into that, let me give you some backstory. This story begins back in 1983 when Andrea Perry went to visit her sister Michelle, who was living in Montana at the time. During her time in Montana, Andrea's sister Michelle introduced her to Mark DelJanovan, who was in the Air Force station there in Montana at the time. Family members later noted that Andrea and Mark only dated for a few weeks before they became engaged. The family described their relationship as very much a whirlwind romance. Shortly after meeting, Mark and Andrea were married on July 29th, 1983. They eventually left Montana and moved to Corgi Station, Pennsylvania, so they could be closer to Mark's parents. They were still living there in Pennsylvania when their son Josh was born on July 8th, 1990. Now, I don't have much background information about their home life, but their neighbor Susie back in Pennsylvania said she never noticed anything wrong in their household. Obviously, you never really know what's going on in the four walls of someone's home, but she said she didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. She said her and Andrea were really good friends. They would borrow things from each other. She had a son who was around Josh's age at the time, and the two of them would take turns carpooling the boys and watching each other's sons. Susie stated that she stayed in touch with Andrea by writing letters back and forth once the DelJanovans moved to Michigan. And actually, in April of 1996, Andrea, Mark, and Josh moved to Michigan in order to be closer to Andrea's mother, who was undergoing surgery for cancer. When they moved to Michigan, they moved in with Andrea's sister-in-law, Lorraine, in Grass Lake, Michigan. And apparently the house was super crowded. There was about 9 different people living there, and Mark actually only lasted a month before he moved back to Pennsylvania. And he actually moved back following an argument that he had with Andrea's mother over how she saw him disciplining her grandson, Josh. So obviously she didn't like what she saw. They got into it and he took his tail back to Pennsylvania. However, and I could also say, unfortunately, he returned only a few days later to try to work things out. When he got there, he argued again with Andrea, and then he eventually moved out for a final time. He actually stayed in a hotel for a bit before he found a duplex on Lee Road there in Jackson County, where Josh would eventually come and visit him. At the time of this tragedy, it sounded like Mark was just working odd jobs, and Andrea had actually begun working in a mailroom at a place called Bookkeepers in Chelsea, Michigan, back in October of 1996, and that was actually the first job she had held since Josh was born. A month after starting that job, she filed for divorce. In the divorce, she was granted custody of Josh, but Mark was given visitation every Wednesday for 2 hours, and allowed to be with Josh every other weekend. He was also able to call Josh every evening before 8 p.m. and was ordered to pay roughly $70 a week in child support. Now, Andrea strongly believed and feared that Mark might possibly harm her and Josh. And based on Mark's pattern of behavior, her fears were not unwarranted. And because of his past behaviors and threats, she was able to convince a judge to put in place a protective order against Mark. Apparently, throughout the divorce proceedings, Mark had continued trying to pressure her into reconciliation, but she wasn't interested in that, which is perfectly fine, and that is her right. Clearly, she saw something that maybe those around her didn't see. According to her sister-in-law, Andrea had wanted Mark to seek counseling, and he did for a while, but then he stopped. And it was said that Andrea was torn between going back to Mark, but she didn't want to be abused, and she didn't want her son to be subjected to such violence. So that is why Andrea was living with family in hopes that Mark would get his act together, but unfortunately, that never happened. Andrea had even become convinced that Mark would either harm or kidnap Josh. And so after December 18th of 1996, she actually didn't allow Josh any further visits with his father. She blocked the visits. And I'm not going to judge her for that. She had been married to Mark since 1983. No telling what she had experienced in that home with them. She knew what she was dealing with, and she knew what she was doing. And she was making the best decision that she could with the information and knowledge that she had. And based on the outcome of this case, she was right on the money and she was on to something. I would call it her women's intuition. So anyway, she blocks Josh's visits with his father after December 18th. And Josh was actually supposed to spend 6 days with his father beginning Christmas Day of 1996, but she didn't let him go. According to court records, she also didn't let Josh talk on the phone with his father every single time he called. And because of this, the Friday before this tragedy, which would have been February 14th, 1997, Andrea and Mark were back in court. During that court appearance, Andrea pleaded with Judge Alexander C. Perlos to grant supervised visitation, but the judge refused and ordered her to live up to the original visitation schedule that was written into the divorce decree. Now, apparently, Andrea was not the only person who saw the signs. Mark had a neighbor, Miss Mary Salyer, who lived next door to his duplex. And actually, up until about a month before this tragedy, she would clean his home every Saturday. And when she was there, she said he often complained about his ex-wife, Andrea. Mary said, and I quote, "I think I knew him as well as anybody, and he could be pretty scary at times." She also mentioned that he was gun happy and constantly paranoid that someone was watching him. She said he was always talking about going out in a blaze of glory with all the big boys there. Whatever that means. Mary, the neighbor, also stated that Mark had told her in the past that if he ever got a hold of Josh, that she, meaning his ex-wife Andrea, would never get him back. The neighbor just assumed that at worst he might take him out of the state, considering that Mark was not originally from the area. Unfortunately, Mark, being the menace that he is, took it much further than that. The neighbor went on to state in an interview that Mark would spend his money on two things: court costs to get his son back, and presents for his son so that Josh would want to come and stay with him. The neighbor Mary had a son who was in the same first grade class as Josh, and the two were best friends. Mark had asked her what type of toys that kids, 6-year-old boys, liked, and she told him, and he went out and bought roughly $500 worth of presents for Josh, which $500 worth of presents in 1997 is like $1 million worth of presents now. And all he did was work odd jobs. So that kind of confuses me. But whatever. Because Andrea refused to let him see Josh because she was fearful of what her estranged husband Mark was capable of, he was unable to give those gifts to Josh that Christmas. When they went to court on February 14th, 1997, ironically Valentine's Day, as I mentioned before, the judge told Andrea that she had to follow the court order. While she was there in court, Circuit Judge Alexander Perlos completely rejected Andrea's request for supervised visits, even though records showed that Mark had violated the personal protection order that she had against him at least once back on December 20th. According to reports from the Jackson County Sheriff's Department, Mark had called his wife and allegedly said, "I told you not to do this. Now you're going to pay." According to the police report, Andrea claimed that her husband threatened to kill her, her son, and any family member that got in his way. She also told the police that he kept several weapons in his house. And I guess none of this was considered a red flag by the courts. In court, the judge said that, and I quote, "I'm not concerned he's going to harm that boy. He may harm his wife, but not the boy." Which makes absolutely no sense to me. You think he would be willing to harm his wife, but not his child? The way he could harm his wife the most is by doing something to that child. That is insane logic on the part of the judge, in my humble opinion. Following the incident, her sister-in-law stated that Mark had started making threats to Andrea, and she was very afraid of him. The sister-in-law also stated that he said he would make her worst nightmares come true, which was her waking up one morning and finding her whole family dead. So anyways, despite her protest and requests for supervised visits between Mark and Josh, they were not granted. And this is just speculation on my part, but she was probably threatened with jail time if she didn't comply. Like, I've heard that be a thing. Like, you don't comply, well, you're going to go to jail. So anyways, she complied. And remember, that was February 14th, a Friday. And so that Sunday, February 16th, Mark picked up Josh, and a half hour into the visit, both Mark and Josh were dead. It sounds like as soon as Josh arrived at his father's house, Mark gave him all the Christmas presents that he had purchased and he had been saving for him since he had been unable to give them to him previously. Being an excited little boy, Josh wanted to call and tell his mom about his presents, so his father allowed him to call his mother. However, in my mind, this was probably just a ploy. Like, "Ooh, go call your mom and tell her about your gifts." And I think that because once Andrea answered the phone, the father got on the phone and asked Andrea if they could get back together. And of course she said no, as was her right and as she should. However, when she said no, they began arguing back and forth, and she heard her son scream, followed by a shot. Her sister-in-law, Lorraine, with whom she was staying, heard Mark and Andrea arguing, so she picked up the phone upstairs because apparently the courts had said that there needed to be a witness to his threats and abuse. So because of this, the line was still open, So Andrea ended up running out of the house and calling 911 from the neighbor's house while her sister stayed on the open line until Mark hung it up roughly 2 minutes later. So ultimately, after the shots were heard, emergency services were called from both Andrea's home, well, the home she was staying in, and also the neighbor's house. At about 12:10 p.m. on Sunday, February 16th, 1997, sheriff's deputies were called to check the welfare of a child at 8453 Lee Road in Leone Township, Michigan. Andrea told the operators that she was calling because she heard gunshots over the phone while talking to her estranged husband. She also told them that he had made threats toward their son. When the deputies arrived on the scene, they were unable to make contact with Mark, so they ended up shooting tear gas into the home before breaching the door. When they finally entered the home, they found two people dead. So unfortunately, the gunshots that Andrea had heard over the phone were fatal gunshots. Deputies found a 44 caliber Magnum in the house, which they believed to be the murder weapon. Mark was found with a gunshot to the chest. Deputies said Josh was found in the living room. It appeared he had been playing video games when his father fatally shot him at close range. Police refused to state where Josh had been shot on his body, so I can only imagine. Of course, immediately after this, there was a lot of backlash. The family blamed the court system, stating those supervised visits should have been granted, which in hindsight they certainly should have been. The judge, however, defended his actions by saying, "I've been in the court for 40 years, and this has never happened to me before. I haven't seen a child's life taken like this." There was an opinion piece printed in the local newspaper which asked the question, should the system have prevented this tragedy? But then it went on to state that no one can predict the unpredictable, and that in fact, the DelJanovan tragedy points out that it's not so much that the court system failed one family, but that one man failed his family and chose the ultimate selfish solution to solve his problems. Mark DelJanovan was the wrongdoer here and not the judge. And I kind of can't argue with that statement. But I will say that there were a lot of things that the court could have and should have considered. Sue Paschal, the executive director of the Aware Shelter at the time, which is a shelter and counseling center for abused women and children, was interviewed, and she pointed out that the most dangerous time in a relationship is where the DelJanovans were, which was the end. For abusive men or just partners in general who thrive on an unhealthy perception of power and control, the loss of that control can sometimes overwhelm them. And in many cases, it is more than they can stand. And unfortunately, the repercussions of Mark's inability to control the situation pushed him to cause as much pain and hurt that he possibly could to his estranged wife. In the end, Mark used his own child to exact the most severe revenge possible on Andrea. A local marriage counsel at the time pointed out that many times parents use their children and their children become pawns during divorce proceedings. Even so, Mark's actions were extreme. In my opinion, Mark didn't really want or care about his son. All he wanted to do was control Andrea, and Josh was essentially what he was using as a remote control to try and do that. He decided the only way to have the final say and to cause the most pain to Andrea was to take the life of his son. Mark was not only a weak individual, but he was also unwilling to face the consequences of his actions. So he then turned the gun on himself so that he would not have to answer for what he did to 6-year-old Josh. At the time of his passing, Joshua was 6 years old and he was a first grader at George Long Elementary School in Grass Lake, Michigan. Josh was described as a boy who ate pizza every day at lunch, dressed in jeans and t-shirts, and wore Nike tennis shoes. Reading was Joshua's favorite subject, and Candyland was his favorite book. He liked to play catch, ride bikes, and dress up like the X-Men comic book characters. In the wake of his death, a small library was created in honor of Josh's memory at his school. It was established to help children cope with death, divorce, and other difficult issues. One of Josh's last school projects on Valentine's Day was to write why they loved their parents. Josh wrote, "I love my mom because she helps me with things. I love my mom. She's the best." Had his father not taken his life at the age of 6, today Joshua would be less than a month away from his 36th birthday. As always, thank you so much for kicking it with me today. I appreciate you for listening to the end. I plan to continue telling stories from my hometown of Jackson, Michigan and the surrounding areas. If you have any stories that you would like me to tell, feel free to reach out to me. I'm currently just kind of winging this channel, but I would love to tell a story from the perspective of the victim's family. And I would like to do that because I would love to be able to provide more insight and substance about the victims from loved ones. So if there's anyone out there who would like to assist me with telling your loved one's story, I would love to make that happen. Thanks again for watching. If you haven't already, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. And don't forget to tell a friend or two or three or four or five. Until next time.